A church is supposed to be a place of worship, where visitors can pray and connect to a holy higher power, yet the buildings are often hundreds of years old, containing dark corners, hidden rooms and chambers, and occasionally other items which might appear to some to be unusual or even downright macabre. In such a holy place, the discovery of such unsettling items can seem in stark contrast to their location, giving the church an especially chilling atmosphere. Here are my choices for 5 highly disturbing and macabre churches. Number 5. The Chapel of Bones. Part of the Royal Church of St. Francis, the Chapel of Bones in Portugal dates back to the 16th century. Like many old cemeteries in medieval Europe, the burial grounds around the church eventually reached capacity, meaning that the bones of the people laid to rest in the 43 cemeteries around the town of Evora needed to be exhumed and placed elsewhere to make space for the fresh corpses of those more recently deceased. Ordinarily, the exhumed bones of the long dead might be placed in catacombs or underground chambers, yet the monks of Evora came up with a more unusual and disturbing way to both store the bones and put them to use. The bones of some 5,000 corpses were turned into macabre building materials and used to construct a new chapel. Cement holds various human bones and skulls together, which form the very walls of the chapel, which gaze lifelessly upon all those who enter their domain. Even the builders of this disturbing piece of architecture are laid to rest here, with the bones of 3 of the monks who founded the church stored inside a small white coffin near the altar. The most chilling aspect of the chapel is the presence of 2 desecrated bodies hanging on the wall from chains next to a cross. The 2 skeletons, one of which is a small child, are clothed in tattered rags and seem to have been hung in position with little care or ceremony, seemingly as some form of punishment or humiliation. Why they have been treated this way remains a mystery, and numerous theories speculate as to what brought about such an undignified end. The most popular legend is that the man was an adulterer and the child the product of his adultery, but the truth of the matter remains debated. So what possessed the monks to construct such a seemingly unholy house of worship? It seems as though the monks wanted the town's citizens to reflect upon the fleeting nature of life. Worried about the growing materialism amongst the town's population, they decided that such an outward display of man's mortality might cause worshippers to reflect upon the temporary nature of their own lives, perhaps motivating them to do good with the small amount of time they had left, before they too joined the spirits of the bones built into the walls around them in the afterlife, be it in heaven or hell. This idea is clearly demonstrated by the famous warning message at the entrance to the chapel, which roughly translates to, "We bones that here are, for yours await," a striking reminder to all those coming here to pray that they too will one day die. Number 4. St. George's Church. Located in the Czech Republic, St. George's Church lay neglected and abandoned for over 40 years before a group of ghostly shrouded figures took up residence in its decaying husk. The church itself has had a long and troubled history. Consecrated in 1352, the church quickly fell victim to an unusually high number of devastating fires, causing local churchgoers to suspect that the building was cursed by some malevolent force. Such rumours of curses and hauntings persisted over the years. However, an unsettling event that took place in 1968 was the final straw. During a funeral service, a large section of the roof collapsed inside the church, showering mourners with debris and causing them to flee to safety. For those who had long suspected that the church was haunted, this event was confirmation that dark forces were at work. From that day, the congregation refused to set foot inside the church ever again, preferring to hold their mass outside rather than risk entering the cursed building. As the years passed, the church fell into further disrepair. Exposed to the elements, the interior began to crumble and decay, with thieves looting anything of value and vandals causing extensive damage. With the church rapidly deteriorating, a group of local residents decided to take matters into their own hands. Believing that the church represented an important part of local history, which was an area which had been ravaged by both world wars, they set about restoring the building. They faced one major obstacle though: repairs would not be cheap, and money was in short supply. They needed to come up with some way to raise funds before the elements destroyed the church beyond repair. It was then that a sculpture student at the University of West Bohemia called Jacob Hadrava stepped in with a brilliant plan. His idea was simple but effective: to turn the church's reputation as being haunted into a tourist attraction, which in turn might raise the funds needed to fix the building. He set to work sculpting a set of 9 ghostly shrouded figures, which were placed in various positions throughout the church, and were to be used to represent the spirits of all those who had prayed inside the church over the long centuries. Some of the wraith-like creations sit on the pews, seemingly in quiet prayer and contemplation, while others stand around by the entrance, keeping a close watch upon all those who enter. The artist's fellow students were used as models, achieving the creepy aesthetic by wrapping them in plastic and raincoats. 9 figures were originally installed in 2014, giving the church its second name of Church of the Nine Ghosts, but since then more have been added, and 30 of the wraith-like figures now reside inside the church. The plan was a success, and word quickly spread through the media. Tourists began arriving to see the creepy faceless figures and take in the crumbling church's eerie atmosphere. After they had toured the building and taken their photographs, the visitors would often leave donations, which quickly added up to a large enough sum to fix the roof and begin securing the structure, saving it from falling into a state of permanent disrepair. Now that the building is safe, the local congregation has also returned, and the unusual sight of living people sitting amongst the lifeless sculptures can be seen at every Mass. Number 3. The Skull Chapel of Czermina. The wooden doors of this seemingly inconspicuous chapel in Poland hide its grisly interior. As you step through the entrance, you are greeted with the unnerving sight of the skulls and bones of over 3,000 people lining the chapel's walls and ceiling, in a building that's more mass grave than church. The chapel was built in 1776 by a local priest who decided to collect the bones of thousands of people who died during the 30 Years' War and the Silesian Wars, as well as the bones of numerous other victims who met their end as a result of cholera and plague epidemics, as well as starvation and even syphilis. He spent 18 years collecting the massive number of bones, exhuming them from mass graves in the local area, before cleaning them and using them to create a macabre memorial to the dead inside the chapel. The remains of 3,000 people decorate the walls and ceiling of the chapel, while a further 24,000 are piled up in a 16-foot deep crypt inside the basement. The human bone building materials he used were in plentiful supply, as the local area had been plagued by war for centuries. The 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 ravaged Central Europe, and although it was originally a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant states inside the Holy Roman Empire, it soon escalated into a general war involving most of the great powers of Europe and resulting in the deaths of an estimated 8 million people. Just a century later, the region would be devastated again by a series of 3 wars, known collectively as the Silesian Wars, which were bloody conflicts between Prussia and Austria for possession of Silesia. These wars, combined with frequent outbreaks of disease, meant that the region was littered with mass graves. According to the story, the priest who built the Skull Chapel would use local dogs to determine the sites of the numerous mass graves, watching where they would congregate for ideas on where to dig. After all the suffering he had witnessed, he was determined to create a shrine for those who had died prematurely at the hands of war and disease, as well as to remind the living that they too would one day die, perhaps hoping to encourage them to live better lives with the short amount of time they have left. The chapel accomplishes what simple facts and figures cannot, vividly displaying the reality of the consequences of war, the thousands of often innocent victims staring lifelessly at any who enter through the chapel's doors. As the years passed and his macabre chapel took shape, the priest began setting aside any unusual skulls he came across during his work. These skulls are still on display today, resting atop the chapel's altar, with the collection containing the skulls of a Tatar warrior, the local mayor at the time along with his wife, a skull dotted with bullet holes, the head of a man riddled with syphilis, and even the skull of a giant. When the priest himself died in 1804, his skull too joined the collection on the altar, the unusual chapel he constructed in life, becoming his final resting place. Number 2. The Basilica of St. Ursula. Located in the German city of Cologne, the Basilica of St. Ursula is built upon the ancient ruins of a Roman cemetery, which according to legend was the burial site of St. Ursula and her 11,000 virgins, who were said to have been slaughtered by invading Huns. The church was constructed in honor of St. Ursula, who was considered a martyr, but the discovery of a mass grave in 1155 convinced church officials that the bones discovered there were those of the martyred saint and her 11,000-strong entourage, and so the church was expanded to house the precious bones, which were now considered highly prized religious relics. The bones of the grave's former occupants are now contained in an area known as the Golden Chamber, where skulls are displayed in protective gold cases and thousands of bones cover the walls, arranged in zigzags, swirls and intricate patterns, with some even spelling out a phrase in Latin which translates as, "Holy Ursula, pray for us." It's unknown exactly how many bones adorn the walls of the Golden Chamber, but there are certainly less skulls than the claimed 11,001. The legend surrounding St. Ursula is mysterious and probably highly exaggerated, and may even be a complete fabrication. She was said to have been a Roman-British princess, who left the British Isles accompanied by 11,000 virgins, who prior to her marriage to a nobleman, set out on a holy pilgrimage throughout mainland Europe. During her stay in Cologne, the city was attacked and captured by invading Huns, who were a nomadic people from Central Asia who conquered large swathes of Europe in the 4th century AD. St. Ursula and her 11,000 virgins were captured by the Huns and massacred after refusing to submit, with the 11,000 virgins being beheaded and Ursula herself shot dead with an arrow. While the official story is that the bones were those of the martyrs, there could be a more sinister explanation for their displays in the Golden Chamber. The addition of these human relics would have made the church an extremely popular spot for pilgrims, and with so many bones found in the mass grave, the church officials would have had a huge supply of the raw materials required to create holy relics from human bones, which could be sold to pilgrims for enormous profits. This theory was further given weight after a local surgeon noticed that some of the skulls were not from women, but were in fact those of babies, children, and even dogs. So who do the bones belong to? Are they really the remains of the legendary saint and her 11,000 virgins, or were the church officials engaging in a grisly and unholy trade in human bones for profit? Number 1. The Church of Bones. On the outside, this rather ordinary looking church looks no different to the thousands of other medieval churches dotted across Europe, yet what's held within is anything but ordinary. Found in a sleepy suburb in the Czech Republic, upon entering this Catholic chapel, you quickly realise why the Sedlec ossuary has become widely known as the Church of Bones, as inside can be found a gruesome collection of the skeletons of up to 70,000 people, which have been fashioned into sculptures and decorations which are both artistic and grotesque. The origins of this unusual church date back to 1278, when a local monastery abbot was dispatched to the Holy Land by the King of Bohemia. When the abbot finally returned home, he brought with him a handful of earth, which he claimed to have removed from the site where Jesus was crucified. He sprinkled the sacred earth around the abbey's cemetery, immediately making the cemetery grounds one of Central Europe's most desirable places to be buried. The death and destruction wrought by the Black Death in the 14th century and the Hussite Wars in the 15th century meant that there was a ready supply of fresh corpses waiting to be interred in the abbey's sacred cemetery, and the site quickly became full. In the 15th century, a new church was built on the cemetery grounds, containing a chapel intended to be used to house the bones of those bodies unearthed during the church's construction. According to the legend, a half-blind monk was given the grisly task of stacking the bones of all the corpses unearthed into 6 massive human bone pyramids inside the chapel, where the disturbing constructions would remain for hundreds of years. In the late 18th century, the chapel came under the ownership of the House of Schwarzenberg, who decided to put the bones to use. The wealthy family hired a skilled woodcarver, giving him the task of transforming the piles of human bones into intricate yet gruesome sculptures and decorations. 4 of the 6 pyramids built by the half-blind monk centuries before were kept intact, however 2 were dismantled and their building materials repurposed. The thousands of bones and skulls from these 2 pyramids were cleaned and bleached to give them a uniform colour before being fashioned into a bizarre collection of decorations which still adorn the chapel to this day. The centrepiece of the collection is a massive, fully functional chandelier of bones hanging from the chapel's ceiling, which contains at least one of every type of bone found in the human body. On either side of the entrance to the main room can be found chalices constructed with femurs and pelvic bones, which have been topped with human skulls, while in each of the 4 corners can be found one of the 4 remaining bone pyramids, measuring up to 3 meters high, which visitors to the chapel have begun leaving offerings next to, supposedly for good luck. Even the House of Schwarzenberg coat of arms has been recreated with human bones, while the woodcarver, not wanting to be forgotten, has left his signature on the wall, which of course is also crafted with bones. The chapel is littered with a whole host of other unsettling decorations, including a ghoulish monument of a Turk getting his eyes pecked out by a raven, which was created to commemorate the victory of Adolf von Schwarzenberg over the Ottoman army in 1598. Disturbingly, the raven was crafted using the hand and wrist of somebody who suffered from such severe arthritis that the bones have completely fused together. So those are my choices for 5 of the most disturbing churches in the world. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments which church you thought was the most unsettling, and I'll see you again on the next video.